So our topic today is a man by the name of Carl Rogers. Now, you may have heard of Carl Rogers if you took any type of intro to psychology class, or if you've done reading into psychology, or like some within the room, you just know Carl Rogers from life. He, during a certain time period, was a very public and very popular psychologist, known for at least a decade to be America's psychologist. But we're going to dive a little bit more into this man, and following the same format of how I covered Freud, we're going to first look at his biography. All right, who was this guy? When did he live? What were kind of his landmark achievements? And once we get his biography down, we're then going to shift into, okay, what did this guy teach? And we're going to think about the implications of Rogerian counseling upon the world in which we live, even upon our lives, in ways that we may or may not have recognized. But to kick things off, I wanted to start with a scripture. Proverbs 29 reminds us, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. Proverbs 29:15. If the word of God is true, and it is, Solomon's wisdom presupposes one of two ideas. Either the inherent goodness of man or the inherent depravity of man. You have to make a choice. So let me read this proverb again, and you make the determination which reality Solomon himself was convinced of. Was Solomon convinced of the depravity of man, man's wickedness, or was Solomon convinced of the goodness of man? Proverbs 29:15. The rod and reproof give wisdom. A child left to himself brings shame to his mother. What is Solomon presupposing? That children, by nature, are not good. Children, by nature, are sinful creatures with a sinful bent. And that bent must be operated against. If you do not operate against that bent correctively, the end result will be shameful. Shameful from a family perspective, shameful from a society perspective. If you forget everything I say about Carl Rogers is the father of humanistic psychology. So Rogers' first error is his rejection of God. Rogers' second error, as he rejects God, he puts all his chips in the basket of secular humanism. The belief that man is inherently good. From Rogers' perspective, there's only one of two reasons why you're not living out your goodness. Either A, environmental circumstances. B, bad self-image. Those are the only two reasons that you've departed from this trustworthy, good human bent. And it permeates his entire approach to counseling, his entire approach to therapy. Carl Rogers. So let me give you a little bit about Carl Rogers and his background. Born January 8th, 1902 in Oak Park, Illinois. He is regarded from a macro perspective as the father of humanistic psychology. He is the mainstream advocate. He's the guy who made popular, he shaped it, he coined it, he sold it, something that's called client-centered therapy. Client-centered therapy. Right? How did he get there? Rogers grew up in a Christian home. His father was a Congregationalist. His mother was a devout Baptist. He was the fourth of 6 children. And Charles Rogers says this with reference to his childhood. He says this about his own childhood, and I quote him, "My parents cared a great deal for us and had our welfare almost constantly in mind. They were also in many subtle and affectionate ways very controlling of our behavior. It was assumed by them and accepted by me that we were different from other people. No alcoholic beverages, no dancing, cards or theater, very little social life, and much work." End quote. Carl Rogers' father was a successful businessman who then purchased a farm. And so from the age of 12 on, up until he leaves for college, Carl Rogers loved all things agriculture, all things connected to the farm. So when he finished high school, Rogers went off to study college. He went off to study agriculture at the University of Wisconsin. During his sophomore year of college, Rogers attended a student religious conference and felt the call to Christian ministry. As a junior, he was one of 12 students selected from the University of Wisconsin to attend an international World Student Christian Federation conference. This is 1922. This is the first time for him to get outside of the U.S. Rogers states concerning this conference and how impactful it was in his life. I'm going to quote him now. He says this, "I was forced to stretch my thinking, to realize that sincere and honest people could believe in very divergent religious doctrines. In major ways, I, for the first time, emancipated myself from the religious thinking of my parents and realized that I could not go along with them. The essential split was achieved during the 6 months I was on this trip to the Orient, and hence was thought through being away from the influence of home." End quote. We might pause here and just remind us all, be very careful of lending your children to Caesar and being shocked when they come back Romans. Now, I think the greater reality is 1 John 2. They went out from us because they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would not have departed. But they departed so that it would be manifest they were not of us. On that trip, Rogers meets a girl that he would later marry, Helen Elliott. After graduating from the University of Wisconsin, Rogers continues to go down this trajectory. After that sophomore year of college, when he went to some type of student religious event and he kind of caught the religious bug, he changed from agriculture to pursuing the ministry. He then goes off to this junior year of college, this big international Christian conference over in the Orient, and begins to have his own kind of awakening, spiritually speaking, distancing himself from the ideals of his parents. But he continues on this trajectory that he's going to be a minister. So after he graduates from the University of Wisconsin, he attends Union Theological Seminary. This is 1924. This is how Rogers explains his choice, and I quote him now. "The most liberal in the country at this time." End quote. He specifically goes to Union because he knows at Union they are very much unlike his parents. They're very much unlike those fundamentalist ideals of the Congregationalists and the Baptists. Much more informed, free thinking, exploratory of the grand truths. While at Union, Rogers determined, and I quote him now again, "I could not work in a field where I would be required to believe in some specific religious doctrine. My beliefs had already changed tremendously and might continue to change. It seemed to me to be a horrible thing to have to profess a set of beliefs in order to remain in one's profession." End quote. So he gets to the end of seminary and he makes this like, I can't be a minister. Why can't you be a minister? I'd have to accept a certain doctrine. I'd need to pick my poison. Am I Baptist, Presbyterian, what am I? What set of Christian beliefs I would need to hold to? And to him, that was so constraining. He wanted to be able to go wherever the ideas would take him. So he then shifted his focus to psychology. And he studies for a couple of years at the Teachers College of Columbia University, where he was trained by Freudian psychoanalytic professors. So he was shown the ways of Freud. If you'll recall from when I spoke last, he was trained in the concept of personality development, the id and the ego and the superego, and the stages of psychological development, from the oral phase to the anal phase to all the different phases. Well, as he finishes his training at the Teachers College of Columbia University, he eventually needs to get a job. Right? Something's got to pay the bills. And he lands a position in Rochester, New York, as a child psychologist. And he will practice there for 12 years. And this 12 years of practice in Rochester, New York, is really where he comes into his own. He's been trained in Freudian psychology, but he's meeting with these problematic youth on a daily basis. He's their psychologist. He's supposed to be the expert. And when you read, this was his best-selling book, On Becoming a Person. When you read this book, he will talk about, basically, during this 12 years, he becomes a pragmatist. He's just like, certain things aren't working. Certain things are working, and he's kind of formulating his own ideas, breaking a little bit away from the constraints of Freud. He has a son and daughter, and he talks about having his own son and daughter and rearing his own children, how that further shapes his thinking. In 1940, he takes a teaching position at Ohio State University, a position that he gains because he published a book that was mildly successful, a book entitled Clinical Treatment of the Problem Child. He publishes that book, then he gets his teaching post at Ohio State. He'll teach there for 5 years, and then he'll move on to the University of Chicago. It's fascinating the degree to which the University of Chicago has shaped American education and where we're at in the 21st century, but that's a whole nother talk. So he eventually gets his way into, we could at least say it this way, he eventually finds himself at a very prestigious university where he is given a big platform. In 1961, he writes this book, On Becoming a Person. Sells millions of copies. Brings him into national recognition. A man by the name of Peter Kramer writes concerning the impact of this book, and I quote him now, "For the decade that followed," so from 1960 to 1970, "Rogers was the psychologist of America, likely to be consulted by the press on any issue that concerned the mind. End quote. So what was Rogers' theory? What is communicated in this book? According to Rogers, when we are born with a true self. But as we grow and develop, our personality splits into two parts. The real self. Okay, what's the real self? It's what you see when you look in the mirror. It's your understanding of who you are. It's how you feel about yourself. Your sense of self-worth. Your self-image. So as we grow and develop, there's our real self, and then there's our ideal self. Okay, what's the ideal self? It's the person you'd like to be. It's the person you ought to be. It's the persons that society would prefer you to be. It's the person that your pastor or church would encourage you to be. Real self, ideal self. And what he basically postulates is that over time, what we find is that there's great incongruence, which is the source of fear, anxiety, anger, and really at the root of all the various problems that you may be facing or having with life are connected to, just picture two circles, that in the idealized state, in the perfect state, your real self and the ideal self overlap completely. But what he's saying is, as you grow and as you go through the ups and downs of life, and as you are confronted with who you are versus who everyone else wants you to be, you see this great divergence, this lack of congruence, and that's the problem. And because of this incongruence, we begin to perform in inauthentic ways. Because we're trying to press our real self into this idealized self, and we're getting ourselves into trouble because we don't have enough self-worth, we don't have the appropriate self-image. We're operating under the constraints of all these societal structures, be it our religion, be it our family expectations, be it pure economics, marriage, parenting, a job you don't like, etc., etc. And so this is leading us to behave in inauthentic ways, and this is why we're not happy. This is why we're unfulfilled. This is why we're so frustrated, bitter, angry, miserable. Rogers, this is where his humanism comes in. Okay, so how do we fix this? How do we fix this? Rogers says the key is through authentic relationships. Through authentic relationships. An authentic relationship is one that's characterized by transparency, unconditional positive regard, and empathy. So Rogers suggested this, that if he could sit down with a person and be so centered upon them, he, as someone who's sitting down to learn about their troubles, if I can hold them in such positive regard, if my therapeutic relationship with them can be one that's characterized by empathy, I labor hard to see life the way they see it. Always holding them in positive regard. Being very careful to be authentic with them. I'm going to be very authentic with them. If I'm angry, I'm going to express my anger with them. If I'm happy, I'm going to express my happiness with them. When they relate with me, they're always going to, I'm going to labor hard. They're not going to have to try to figure out, well, you're saying something, but your tone says this. I'm always going to be this transparent person in this relationship, counselor to client. I'm going to be extremely positive. There's nothing they can say, think, or do that will cause me to frown or disapprove. And I'm going to really empathize. Work really hard to understand them. He believed that in the context of that relationship, this is where the humanism comes in, the client will figure out their problems. And really what's going to happen, they're going to recover their real self. And they're going to begin to deconstruct this ideal self that they've been laboring to try to be. They're going to become more accepting of who they are. They're going to pursue on their own growth and change wherever they feel it's needed. So the goal was self-actualization, which is by definition fulfilling your full potential, becoming one with your ideal self. Remember the two circles? Converging them. That's the goal. Now, I like hearing from people themselves. So I want to read a few excerpts from this book on becoming a person from Carl Rogers and just let you soak it in. He is talking, this is a chapter in his book entitled, This Is Me. And he says the following. Yet the paradoxical aspect of my experience is that the more I am simply willing to be myself in all this complexity of life, and the more I am willing to understand and accept the realities in myself, the more change seems to be stirred up. It's a very paradoxical thing that to the degree that each one of us is willing to be himself, then he finds not only himself changing, but he finds that other people to whom he relates are also changing. At least this is a very vivid part of my experience and one of the deepest things I think I have learned in my personal and professional life. Then he goes on to say this. One of the basic things which I was a long time in realizing, and of which I am still learning, is that when an activity feels as though it is valuable and worth doing, it is worth doing. Put another way, I have learned that my total organismic sensing of a situation is more trustworthy than my intellect. Now, I want you to bear down on this for a minute. And let's think about the implications for how he would counsel, but then let's also think about the implications for where this will take society. Remember, Freud had a very pessimistic outlook on humanity. Freud thought that we had this id, this part of us that had this base desires, very, very sexually driven. Rogers comes along and he has this 180-degree different outlook on humanity. Like, here's what he thinks Freud got wrong. Freud had a dark view of man. Rogers comes along and thinks that people are basically good. And the problem that people have is that they have little self-worth. He traces a lot of that to their upbringing, little self-worth. Or they have a poor self-image. Remember, he's really big on this concept of who you see when you look in the mirror. Your realized self. And he has come to this conclusion that the problem that people have is low self-esteem. Low self-esteem. That's the problem. Instead of being who they are, they're trying to fit into these molds. Molds that came from their parents, molds that came from their religion, molds that came from broader society. He goes on to say this, very closely related to this learning is a corollary. The evaluation by others is not a guide for me. The judgment of others, while they are to be listened to and taken into account for what they are, can never be a guide for me. I have come to feel that only one person can know whether what I am doing is honest, thorough, open, sound, or false and defensive and unsound, and I am that person. Now he says this is a very damning statement if you're a Christian. Neither the Bible, nor the prophets, neither Freud, nor research, neither the revelations of God nor man can take precedence over my own direct experience. My experience is the more authoritative. Now, I thought you might enjoy this. We'll let his words give you an idea of what he thought a person ought to experience when they go to see a psychologist. Here's how he thought they should be helped. On page 66 of his greatest work on becoming a person, he says this, the more that the client perceives the therapist as real or genuine, as empathetic, as having an unconditional regard for him, the more the client will move away from a static, fixed, unfeeling, impersonal type of functioning, and the more he will move toward a way of functioning marked by a fluid, changing, acceptant experiencing of differentiated personal feelings. The consequence of this movement is an alteration in personality and behavior in the direction of psychic health and maturity and more realistic relationships to self, others, and the environment. So what he's saying is this. We don't need Freud's theories. What you need is basically a friend. Someone that will be affirming. Someone that will love you for who you are and focus on you and your feelings, who you think you are, why you're frustrated. And the idea is that if he can develop a healthy therapeutic relationship with you, you will naturally heal yourself. Because his humanism, people are basically good and people move naturally towards self-actualization. People, unhindered, will seek to reach their fullest potential people unhindered will pursue the greatest good. So if you've ever watched a TV show where the quote-unquote psychiatrist is extremely passive and takes an approach to the counseling experience that goes something like this, what would you like to talk about today? And just listens and asks questions and doesn't really advise, just explores your thoughts, explores your feelings. Who shaped that? Carl Rogers. That's Rogerian counseling. Was that the Bob Newhart show? Yeah. Yeah, I know. I only know vaguely of Bob Newhart. Yeah. Now, there's a section, this is a chapter entitled Directions in Therapy, and this is a subtitled, it's called Liking Oneself. He says this: we've established the fact that in successful psychotherapy, negative attitudes towards the self decrease and positive attitudes increase. So what is successful therapy? When I help you decrease your negative attitudes about yourself and increase your positive attitudes about yourself. So, is there going to be any confrontation of sin? No. Is there going to be any correction of any crazy ideas that you may bring to the table? No. The goal is this therapeutic relationship that allows you to reach and grow in this realized self. Now he goes on. He says, but as I examine these statements and compare them with our more recent cases, I feel they fall short of the truth. The client not only accepts himself, a phrase which may carry the connotation of a grudging and reluctant acceptance of the inevitable, he actually comes to like himself. This is not a bragging or self-assertive liking. It is rather a quiet pleasure in being oneself. So again, if you understand his theory, here's what he's saying. The more I'm someone's friend, I'm observing that this person that came in with low self-worth and a bad self-image, over time grows to see themselves as being worth more, grows to having a better self-image. In other words, what he's seeing is the incongruence that has been shaped by life is now moving towards congruence. The realized self and the ideal self are merging. When the realized self and the ideal self overlap, that's when humans achieve self-actualization, reaching your fullest potential, reaching your maximum happiness and contentment. Listen to what he says here. What he's saying, he realizes is not popular. This point of view is so foreign to our present culture that I do not expect it to be accepted. Oh, if he could only see where we're at today, right? He says religion, especially the Protestant Christian tradition, has permeated our culture with the concept that man is basically sinful, and only by something approaching a miracle can his sinful nature be negated. Do you understand how much, do you see how much theology he actually understands? Like his congregational Baptist background, like he understands what the Bible teaches, that you're a sinner, and unless you are born again, you will remain a sinner. He gets the gospel, but he has rejected the gospel. Listen to what he says now. In psychology, Freud and his followers have presented convincing arguments that the id, Man's basic and unconscious nature is primarily made up of instincts which would, if permitted expression, result in incest, murder, and other crimes. I mean, think back to when we covered the Freudian psychosexual development. A child lusts for it. A young boy lusts for its mother, wants to compete, fight, and kill its father. And I'm back to what he says. The whole problem of therapy, as seen by this group, the Freudian group, is how to hold these untamed forces in check in a wholesome and constructive manner, rather than in the costly fashion of the neurotic. But the fact that at heart, man is irrational, unsocialized, destructive of others and self, this is a concept accepted almost without question. As I look back over the years of clinical experience and research, it seems to me that I have been very slow to recognize the falseness of this popular and professional concept. He believes deeply in his humanism and in man's basic goodness. Now, So remember the good question. She said, well, she basically said, how is this guy disseminating his ideas? Well, he publishes books, and he's a teacher of aspiring psychologists, educators at the various places where he serves as a professor. So he's influencing the next generation. Now, I want to survey something quickly. I'm trying to expose you to as much of Rogers as I can using Rogers' own words. This is a chapter entitled, "To Be That Self Which One Truly Is." Now, I want you to think for a minute about the world we're living in, battling against ideas, LGBTQ+. There is such a bent on the idea, just let me be who I really am. Well, who are you really? No one else can determine that. Only I know that. Let me read a little bit and then highlight some things. I observe first that characteristically the client shows a tendency to move away hesitantly and fearfully from a self that he is not. In other words, even though there may be no recognition of what he might be moving towards, he is moving away from something. And of course, in doing so, he's beginning to define, however negatively, what he is. So he believes this is what he's observed in all his clinical practices. As he establishes this healthy, authentic relationship, his clients begin to take off the masks. Now, let's pause for a minute. Is there some experiential truth that the more you get to know someone, the more you see who they really are? Right? And everyone married, everyone who's been a friend, everyone who's lived in a house. Right? There was the dad that everyone thought you had, and there was the dad that you knew. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there's just a depth that comes with proximity and time. So he's noticing that people are letting their guard down. Now, I don't think that's rocket science, but he says they're moving away from sods. He says he also finds that they're moving away from oughts. But I want you to think about why he's observing that. This guy has committed himself to always positively affirm everything. So what does a client begin to learn with him? But this guy thinks everything's good. Like he's super accepting. So not only can I let you in a little bit, but I can be more honest about what I want in life. Because I can be honest with you and you don't recoil. You don't talk about what I ought. I don't talk about what I ought. He then notices how they begin to move away from meeting expectations, move away from a focus on pleasing others. They begin to take more self-direction. Well, why are they taking self-direction? Because you as the counselor aren't suggesting anything to them. Well, what do you think you should do? They begin to move towards complexity, towards openness in experience, towards accepting and trusting themselves. So he says this, I thought this was key. Let me see if I can state more concisely what is involved in this pattern of movement which I see in clients, the elements of which I've been trying to describe. It seems to mean that the individual moves towards being, knowingly and acceptingly, the process he inwardly and actually is. He must move away from being what he is not, from being a facade. He's not trying to be more than he is with the attendant feelings of insecurity and bombastic defensiveness. He's not trying to be less than he is with the attendant feelings of guilt or self-deprecation. He is increasingly listening to the deepest recesses of his physiological and emotional being and finds himself increasingly willing to be with greater accuracy and depth that which he most truly is. Now, because he believes that man is basically good, he's not worried about what you'll do if you just do what feels good and right to you. Of course, you, as a Christian, can understand what will be wrong if a person just gives themselves over to indulging whatever it is that they want. So to sum it up, if you think back to, not necessarily recently, but if you think back to pop culture, and you think back to this train that our culture is on, what is the key to happiness? Be true to yourself. Be who you are. And where we've gotten to is we have a greater willingness today than ever before to tear down those structures, to push back and to rage against the various structures that in history past forced upon us the constraints of the idealized self. So let's deconstruct religion. Let's even deconstruct Western governance. Let's even deconstruct capitalism. Anything that pushed us towards this oppressive, what I ought to be, but this is what I really am, and I'm struggling with the incongruence, I'm miserable. Well, Rogers planted the seed. Rogers planted the seed. Rogers didn't overthrow the system. Rogers planted the seed that in time, generations after Rogers, they'd come along, and if you buy into what Rogers is saying, then what's the key for everyone to be happy? Be who you are. So in the introduction to this book, this was very interesting, and I'll just close with this. From Rogers comes our contemporary emphasis on self-esteem and its power to mobilize a person's other strengths. The modern self-help group arises from Rogers' clinical practice. This guy says, Rogers, even more than Benjamin Spock, is the man who put us on a path of non-directive parenting and teaching. Rogers has chapters towards the end of his book where he applies his ideas to education. Do you know what his ideas of education are? You should go into a classroom and the teacher shouldn't lead. We got to figure out, what are these kids interested in? And we've got to remember, think in this construct. Education is no longer idealized self, what you ought to be, know, do. Education begins to focus upon realized self. What are you interested in doing? What would you like to learn? Everything becomes client-centered. Everything becomes student-centered. Rogers had a huge impact upon modern American education in shifting everyone's focus to student-centered training. Now, when did this happen? When is Rogers hitting his highest point? The best-selling book that he wrote was 1961. What happened in the 1960s? So, you've got several things happening. So, the sexual revolution and Carl Rogers. Where's Carl Rogers influencing people? University setting. And what are the young minds on the university hearing from Carl Rogers? Down with the idealized self, down with religion, down with political structures, and what you need is to be who you are. And so, free love, gay, queer.
Every man did what was right in his own.
It is the book of Judges. Every man does what's right in his own eyes. Yeah. What's shocking, though, is how this permeates Disney. Like when you think about what are the themes that are being promoted in children's movies, the inherent goodness, the humanism, the inherent goodness of man. How many bad guys aren't really bad guys? They just need a friend.
In the Disney movies decades ago, the smartest person in the family was the 8-year-old boy or the 8-year-old girl, and the dumbest person in the movie was the father. Mm-hmm. And this has permeated television for decades.
And so that thought there is very interesting when you think about Rogers' concept that we begin we begin at a place of congruence. Your realized self, you haven't lived long enough to see the disconnect between idealized self and realized self. So you begin at congruence, but over time, because of environment, incongruence develops. So we've got to work hard to reestablish congruence. So if you're consistent with that in mind, who's going to be better? The youth. Because the youth haven't been moved towards incongruence. The children really have the wisdom because they're not operating as much in the oughts of life. They're free to just be who they are. Very, very interesting. Carl Rogers and the impact. This book, I had to read it for a class. Highly readable book. The chapters may induce vomiting because they're filled with garbage. But it's a fascinating thing if you're looking for a good read that will help explain to you how we've gotten where we've gotten in society. Rogerian counseling. Because basically the only type of counseling that's being done right now in all things LGBTQ plus, it's not called anymore Rogerian counseling, it's just called affirmative therapy. But what is affirmative therapy? You know who you are. We're going to be really positive about who you are. And we're going to help you as you navigate throwing off idealized self, what your parents want you to be, what your church wants you to be. We're going to help you navigate that as you're trying to live in congruence. And here's what's interesting, because I've read them. You read the books on modern counseling. This is what kids are getting at the schools. This is what kids are getting when they're getting taken to the shrink. The therapist is focused on one thing. He's focused on congruence. Congruence. Who you feel you are aligning with the person and life you pursue. That's their goal. Because to them, that's self-actualization. That's where you're going to find fulfillment and happiness, because that to them is the whole purpose of humanity. Now you can understand how they look at Christians with such shock and horror. That we would dare authoritatively say to someone, this is who you are. This is how you need to be. And in doing so, you would find happiness and contentment. Okay? Let's close. God, I pray that you'd give us growing discernment. And Father, I pray that you will awaken not just your church, but Lord, I pray that in your mercy you might awaken people within our day and culture to the reality that there is a way that leads to destruction, and that is the way of man. But they would see in contrast there is a way that leads to life, and that way is your word. And help us, as Moses implored the people of Israel, help us to choose life. In Jesus' name, amen.